Okay, so we continue on. We're getting closer and closer to the end. Look out. So we're working our way through the moral section of the catechism. After a little bit of an interlude to talk about some of the spiritual pillars of the church from the catechism about the life of prayer and holiness, especially as we're getting ready for Lent. And now we come back to the moral section. And beginning next week, we'll get into the specific commandments. And that's always exciting because so let's talk about what specific sins are related to what commandments. So always a juicy topic, and we'll take that over several days. But this is still a little bit more of that theory. Before we get into those practical details, the last time that we got into this part of the moral life, we were talking about the person's individual response. So that had to do with how we respond to God's grace by using our conscience, our free will, growing in virtue, trying to avoid vice, things like that. That, if you remember that session. This time we deal with another aspect of the moral life, and this has to do not so much with the individual, but more with the community, because that is a very important part of the church's teaching on the moral life is the human community, not just how we respond to the call to live a good life privately or individually, but also as we do this as a society. And so it touches on some other themes and this is where sometimes things can get a little bit political. We can kind of deal with things that might seem liberal or conservative. So that's juicy too. That makes it exciting. And it has to do with our society and how we interact as a society. And so it actually is really an important thing. So they're good, important topics, and so we'll dive into those as well. So one of the things we would say about our living as members of a community, we are actually meant to be in community. We are meant to live in society or in relationship with one another. Why is that? Because we are made in the image and likeness of God. And how does God exist? As a community of three persons. Three persons in one God. So God is not solitary or alone, but the three persons of the Trinity are constantly in communion with one another, loving one another, so always remaining bound together in love for one another. And so we have that printed upon us as well. We have a desire and a need to be in community. We recognize that especially in the family, which you might say is kind of that first and primary community. Sometimes John Paul II had a phrase for that when she talked about the domestic church. He says this is the church in its smallest form, not the individual, the family. He said the family constitutes the smallest unit within the church, which is that smallest community, a community that is part of the natural order. It's part of the nature of the human person to be in family and then to be drawn into family. So that's an important thing. Anytime we talk about any community or society, whether it's the family or whether it's even up to very large organizations or societies, we're always talking about a group of persons that somehow are bound together. They're bound together because they share some kind of a common purpose or some characteristic. So it's sort of a general way of speaking about society. And so that could be a society, that could be a chess club, that could be the citizens of the United States, that could be a union, a labor union, it could be anything. So it could be the alumni of a school for all we know. And so in a general sense, we can talk about societies or community in this sense. But one of the things that should be a part of any human society, any authentic human society, is it should put the human person first. So sometimes when you talk about a society or community, they might be drawn together by some particular purpose, but the person always comes first as opposed to the purpose. So if you're talking about a club or a group for some particular purpose, let's say that you had a political action committee or some organization that was trying to achieve some political end. If they strive so much to achieve that end and you lose sight of the human person, that becomes corrupt. That's not an authentic communion of persons. So the Catechism really brings out the essential importance that you put the human person first. And so it's not that you have some extrinsic thing, but you have individual persons who are bound together in a communion, in a community oriented toward some particular end, some particular noble end, ideally. And so one of the values of our communities or societies is that they grant a certain amount of stability in our world. And that's an important thing. This is why this is not something that's trivial or just to be thrown away, but we really rely on these communities. They define our relationship with one another. So for example, by being a member of or a citizen of the United States, so we are bound together by a certain kind of common purpose, living under a set of laws. And that set of laws, for example, that everyone agrees that when we use a common currency or common language or we observe common laws, all of these things help to promote the stability of a culture or of a nation. So there is something to be said about this idea of stability that is achieved through communities of persons. And the church writ large is also a community of persons. And so we also are bound by common aspects as well, sharing the same faith, the same sacraments, and the same ecclesiastical governance. Under the authority of the Pope. And that's another kind of society. So you can be part of more than one society at a time. So we can sometimes work on multiple levels. When we talk about promoting a particular end, so a society can be formed based on a religious ideal. So for example, sharing the same faith. It could be based on a social goal, a political goal, or an economic goal. But one of the dangers to be avoided in any society, though, is the extensive intervention by the state. Remember how I said that it's important that they cultivate the human person. They should be oriented toward the human person. If the human person gets subordinated to or forgotten underneath a too powerful state that was somehow dominating or domineering the individual persons, that begins to get out of order. The human person who is meant to benefit from the society ends up becoming a cog in that wheel, and that in fact is actually not a good thing. That is a danger to society. The Catechism emphasizes subsidiarity, which is an interesting principle. That the concept of subsidiarity is that you leave people to make as many decisions as possible on the lowest level necessary. So if you kind of leave things to the local level as much as possible. Let the individual person enjoy their freedom to live as they believe that they should. So don't impose restrictions that are unnecessary to allow them to achieve that end. And when you're talking about the governance, you let things on the local level be managed as much as possible on the local level, and you only reserve to those higher levels the things that are truly necessary. The Catechism extols this as an important characteristic and an important aspect of freedom. So there is a desire to avoid a sense of collectivism in which we subordinate ourselves to this larger collective. We sacrifice our individuality and our freedom in such a case, and so society should be mindful of preserving that legitimate autonomy that we should have. Society does have a legitimate participation in the work of governing the world. So remember when Adam and Eve were created, God said to them, subdue the world. So multiply, subdue the world, and order it. And so, who exercises authority in the world? Well, God ultimately exercises authority, but he also allows us to have a share of authority in the governing and the ordinance, ordering of the world. And so a society does have a legitimate role in defining those roles, responsibilities, and obligations so as to preserve that order and to help us to flourish in a society. That's the goal of a society. Sounds very, very ideal, doesn't it? Isn't that how societies always work? Oh, well, unfortunately, you can probably come up with a lot of examples where it doesn't work so well, or we see abuses in that order. But it's nice to kind of have an image that's presented that really shows what our culture and society can and even should be. And so we wish to work toward that. And for that reason, the Catechism next goes into a section on the importance of conversion. Now, we think of conversion most often as an individual thing, so we all need to undergo conversion. We have a tendency to sin, and we need to be constantly engaged in conversion to try to avoid the effects of sin. But it's interesting that this can also be applied on a societal level. Society is oftentimes also in need of constant conversion. The dangers that can happen within a society is that we become too self-absorbed, too individualistic, Individual people can be too focused on power. When these things happen, things become out of order. And so there's constantly that need for conversion, constantly the need to kind of challenge, to hone, and to refine our society so it does not go off in the wrong direction. Sometimes a society that begins to go astray starts to substitute and confuse the means and the end. They start to say that the ends justify any means whatsoever. These are all examples of ways in which a society has begun to lose its way. And so one of the things that we can do is ask for God's grace to intervene and assist us, and to ask for God's grace for our society too. And that may seem like kind of a strange prayer to make, but we can pray not just for our own guidance, but we can pray, for example, for our country and for our country's moral guidance. It's a very important thing for us to do and to be also engaged in. When we talk about the authority, those who are in positions of authority, it is a truth. We can say it's a fundamental truth that someone has to be in charge, right? If you have a group of people and no one's in charge, what do you have? It's chaos. You have the Lord of the Flies. If you have a group of boys and no one's in charge, look out. Okay, that's bad news. So there is, in fact, a need for persons to step forward in positions of authority. Every society needs to have this, needs to have someone who will give guidance, shape, and order to that society, and who will define what those rules are. St. Paul spends some time really emphasizing this. In Romans chapter 13, it's an interesting part of Romans when he gets onto some of the practical advice he gives toward the end of the epistle to the Romans. In Romans 13, he talks about how God has entrusted to the different leaders of the two various kings and those in authority, he has entrusted to them a share in this legitimate power to govern. And that all authority is rooted in God, and so those who exercise authority on this earth have a share in God's authority. And you can say that they participate in God's authority, and in fact the source of their authority is rooted in God. And that's always an important thing for anyone in authority to remember, the importance of looking to God with a certain amount of humility, not to just simply claim authority and then to let that go to one's head. Does that ever happen? That never. Okay. The counterexamples are going to be too many to give, because I bet we can, every time I say one of these things, this is how it should be, I bet we could all come up with about 8 examples of how that's not how it works. But so for politicians, their authority should not go to their head. Let them know that not only is, in this country we talk about the power to govern, that authority derives from the people, but in a theological sense, we'd say actually the authority derives from God. And so God is the one who is the author of that authority. So it should always be used in a way that is compatible with God, that responds to the way in which God would want us to govern, that we would be moral and humble in the exercise of that authority. At the same time, while there is a legitimate authority, and that authority is a participation in God's authority, we also recognize that there are a variety of different political regimes that we find in the world. The Catechism observes this and accepts this. So we don't expect that every society is going to be identical one to another. And one of the things that we'll notice, though, is that sometimes in a particular country or society or nation, that the exercise of that authority can begin to go astray, and we can say that actually is no longer a good, but it crosses over into something that's harmful when it begins to violate certain fundamental principles. And there we can probably find plenty of examples to point out the flaws or the faults in various systems of governance. And so while we can say that the idea that there are a variety of governments and that there is a legitimate good that they exercise, of course, like we can also say with any one of us, we recognize the tendency to sin, so we can probably also find signs of a certain amount of corruption in every political regime. Where they begin to really go astray is when a regime or an authority, the authority governing a society, begins to act contrary to the natural law, and I'll talk more about natural law a little further on in this. When it's not supporting public order, if we're no longer contributing to the public order, or if we're disrespecting the fundamental rights of persons, If a regime, if a government has to thrive and maintain its strength by subjugating and actually disrespecting the individual rights of the persons in that country, that becomes immoral. And then also if the regime or the government begins to act against the common good. So that's another term that's going to come up a little bit later. Actually, we're going to talk about that right now, the idea of the common good. But when I talk about natural law and the common good, these are things these are kind of general principles that always have to be respected. When they're not respected, that would be a sign that there's a corruption within that society, or something that is tending toward evil within that regime or within that government. So I mean, speaking in very general terms here, and we could probably give lots of examples for any of these. But let's say a little bit about the common good, because as we say, well, you know, we pray that everyone in society would work toward the common good, and that sounds like a very nice thing to say. Well, what does that mean, to say that we should support the common good? That the institutions within our societal structures should promote the common good, so that the various entities within our government, the various groups or groups of persons functioning within our society, they should all be contributing to the common good, including ourselves individually. Well, what does that mean? The common good entails several persons, several things. We want, in each of these cases, we want a person to be able to reach their fulfillment, to be fulfilled, to achieve their end or their goal. And so that would mean it is absolutely necessary that there exist a respect for human persons and also a respect for their inalienable rights. That doesn't mean that we get to do anything we want, but that the notion that we have rights and those rights should be respected, especially fundamental rights, and in particular, things having to do with the right of conscience. So to respect our conscience is in fact one of those fundamental inalienable rights that should be safeguarded and preserved by a society. And so that, for example, a person being able to abide by their conscience. They says, well, in conscience I cannot do this. I would find this to be immoral. If a society compels someone to do something that their conscience forbids, that is not seeking the common good. And so that could be, you know, a doctor who might be compelled to perform a procedure that he would find morally reprehensible, or things like that. That would just be one example. So to respect a person, their inalienable rights, and in particular their conscience. A second thing that's critical, beyond the respect for the person, also the idea of societal well-being, promoting societal well-being. This is not just the good of the individual, but the good of our society. And what would be those types of things that should be respected? Well, for example, ordering a society in such a way that everyone has reasonable access and is able to receive the necessities for life. Food, clothing, shelter, that everyone has an opportunity to work, to support themselves with a decent standard of living. Other things that would be important for societal well-being is reasonable access to education, providing culture for enrichment, for the enrichment of the person, and the safeguarding of the family. And this is not an exhaustive list. There would be more to it than that. But these would be, you might say, just the basics of a decent society. Now, how all that's done, okay, now there are lots of different ways of doing that. And this is where you sometimes see differences in the way that different governments do different things. For example, notice that the Catechism isn't taking sides when it comes to the best way or the right way, quote unquote, to provide these goods. So, you know, if you have, for example, a system that allows for the private industry to supply these needs, or maybe something is organized where it's a public venture and it will be the government that administrates or provides certain things. The Catechism doesn't take sides on that. What is the right tax rate, for example? The Catechism doesn't say. I mean, when one society, they may have higher taxes and the government may provide more services. In another society, there may be lower taxes and services may be available in more of an open market or in a free market way. The important thing is that the necessities of life are provided in an equitable way in which people have that equal access or reasonable availability of those things that are necessary for that societal well-being, for the good of a society. That would be a second fundamental criterion. The individual, respect for the individual person, and then the promotion of those things necessary for societal well-being. And then finally, the common good also requires an environment that is filled with peace and security. We all rely on a certain amount of peace and security. If we're in a situation in which there is no peace, if we're in a constant state of war or conflict or violence, if a society is plagued by violence, then you cannot achieve the common good. If we have just chaos in a certain area or territory, then you're not able to achieve to be fulfilled, to reach your goal. You're constantly concerned for your person or for your family. So having reasonable security and a reasonable, peaceful, lawful society, that is an important characteristic for the common good. So when we talk about this, a society that would behave in a moral way, that would be an ideal society, so among the things that I mentioned, so the idea that they would respect the natural law and public order, the fundamental rights of persons, and the common good. The common good includes all of those different things that were mentioned there. It's a very nice picture. I mean, it gives you kind of like, these are wonderful things. And maybe at times, in fact, as I'm kind of going through this, I'm kind of thinking, in the back of my mind, I'm sort of making applications, and maybe you are too. You might be thinking about, okay, well, here's how it's done in the United States, here's what happens in China, here's what happens in Europe, here's what happens in North Korea. You might be thinking of specific examples and say, oh, okay, this doesn't look so good here or there. At times, sometimes though, as I think about it, there are actually some really encouraging things. So sometimes we do see ways in which society really does, I think, take some of these things very seriously. And when we see that, that actually is a noble thing. That is a good thing within our society or within our government. And so it's good actually to recognize the things that in fact are positive, but we also recognize the need for reform, that importance of conversion that I mentioned a little bit ago. We always need to strive for that conversion, to better our society, to challenge our society, to grow and to be better than it was before. And that's not measured just simply by the GDP or something like that. It's not measured just merely by productivity or how many goods or services are produced, but it's measured using other criteria which have more to do with really how the human person is respected and able to thrive. And that's really a much more important metric to use. So with respect to this idea of promoting the good, the common good, and the good of society, there is now a duty that we have. And sometimes this might be a little uncomfortable too, because maybe we don't always want to engage in this sense. But the Catechism speaks of a responsibility that every one of us has, and none of us is exempt from this, to engage in the public life. Now for some, that means engaging in a very specific way by running for office or being engaged in political campaigns, and doing that work of really trying to, in fact, improve society. And in the end, much perhaps contrary to what we might think of most politicians, they're all trying to help our society, right? Well, you might have your own opinions about particular politicians and what their goals are, but in the end, that's really what the entrance into political life is all about. It's trying to serve our society to make it better, or at least it's what it should be. We all have a responsibility to engage in the public life. Now, for some of us, though, that doesn't mean running for office. For priests, we cannot run for office. Priests are not allowed to take an active part in political parties or be elected to positions of governance. So there are some things I cannot do by law. But we can all be good citizens, and we can all exercise our civic responsibilities. In particular, in this country where we have access and the opportunity to vote, it means, I think, being a responsible citizen means voting. So being knowledgeable about the issues that come up in elections, and then participating in those elections so as to be able to work toward that good of society. So choosing men and women as representatives, as elected officials who will in fact do well for our society. That is a responsibility for us to have. But not just simply by voting. It's not just enough to say that we vote and to say that we pay taxes. That's an important part of supporting a society. So abiding by those rules, so we respect the laws. So when you're out driving, you observe the rules of the road. When living in a society, to pay one's taxes. You can complain about it, okay, that's okay, that's nothing says I guess you can't have your own opinion about it, but the idea that we would do our part and support our society by contributing to the moral order, by the orderly, the lawful observance of society, and supporting our community or our country or our society, that's an important aspect of being a responsible member of a community. But it also means that call to conversion that I said before, that we always need to kind of challenge and push, that means also being ready to engage in that work as well, which is to confront the elements within our culture or our society that in fact are harmful toward the goals that they should be achieving. And different people will find that is easier for some and more difficult for others. And precisely how we do that is something that each individual person has to discern. But the notion that every one of us has a responsibility to the society and to do our part to try to shape the society is also an important characteristic. So none of us get a pass. We just don't get to sit back and just say, well, the hell with everything, and there's nothing I can do about it. Well, that's not true. So it oftentimes may seem like there's not much we can do, but nevertheless, we all should be engaged in that work of building up a better world, of supporting our society. And also to developing a culture of holiness. And that's maybe not the first thing you would think of with respect to our society, but the Catechism brings this out, and this is a good thing for us to think about, is that to live a life of holiness, we think about the ways that the saints lived remarkable and holy lives, and they transformed the world around them. The saints actually made a difference. You think of the impact that they made on the lives of people around them. And the truth is we can do the same. And this is where the challenge comes for us to live personally a life of holiness and to challenge our society to grow also in holiness, to foster, to cultivate, and to develop a culture of holiness within our world. This leads to the next section on this part of the Catechism on social justice. And so what is it? Social justice is sometimes a buzzword because I think if you just hear the word in just sort of common circles, people would, I think, typically associate social justice with like liberal political ideology. So sometimes you'll hear about social justice or social justice warriors. In its root definition, and so when the Catechism is speaking about these terms, we're using them technically and not in a political or according to their cultural connotation in our own society, but the actual denotation, the actual meaning of that. So justice is to render unto each that which is their due. So to give to each what is their due. And when we say social justice, then we're speaking on a societal level. So in other words, to promote a society that is ordered toward justice, toward giving and directing things in the way that they should be. So this is going to bring up some themes that we've already talked about a little bit. So one of them, if we want to say that we are working towards social justice, means that this would involve the respect for every human person. This is not new. We kind of already talked about this as a fundamental responsibility of every society. So social justice means that we should always work for the respect for every human person. We should respect their individual rights, which include their conscience, so as to not violate a person's conscience. That would be contrary to social justice, to compel someone to do something that in conscience they cannot do. Nor should a person be coerced with violence. Sometimes that happens in some societies. There's great pressure that kind of urges or compels. It might come in the form of government directives from a heavy-handed government that might order people to do certain things. For example, limit the number of children that a family is allowed to have by law. That would be an immoral intrusion by a government. But it can also happen in sort of a societal sense. And I think I don't know that I would have said this before in previous times talking about this, but that drive within parts of our own society to want to quote unquote cancel a person because you said the wrong thing or thought the wrong thing, that's also an immoral coercion. That's actually a grave evil. is to try to compel or coerce someone toward a certain action, especially if the thing that a person's being coerced toward is itself not a moral thing. Respect for the human person can be summed up in the golden rule. So a good way for us to think about applying that is that we should always treat others and do unto others the way we would want them to treat us and do unto us. If we practice the golden rule, that is a good way for us to put into practice this fundamental respect for the human person. And when we talk about respecting the human person in particular, we should be sensitive to those who are in lower positions. So when we think of the poor or the marginalized, for those who find themselves in great difficulty, that respect for the human person needs to be all the more mindful of those, especially who would have limited ability to change their own circumstances. So they deserve special consideration. And we can sum up this respect for the human person as calling us to follow that second great commandment, to love your neighbor. And so love your neighbor. This is more than just saying, well, I'll give you whatever is just, but to wish the best for one's neighbor, to be filled with charity toward all, so as to have that respect for each human person and to be moved by love to help them to be the best that they can be. This, in fact, is in its most ideal form, this idea of respecting the human person. So in particular, the poor, the marginalized, we might even include the unborn. That would be an important part of social justice. Another aspect of social justice, which is really necessary, is to work for equality, that principle of equality. We see sometimes disparity, which can be unjust, but to recognize the equality. This doesn't mean that everyone's the same, but that we provide recognition of the equal dignity among men. So whether it's between men and women, between people of different races, between people of different cultures, so to recognize that every human person is made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore all deserve respect. So we would treat them with the respect that is owed to anyone who is made in the image and likeness of God. So to work toward that equality, lots of times we recognize a lack of equality, and those where we find that in fact can, especially where it's being purposely cultivated or fostered, that actually can be an evil. So that respect for equality should be extended to the very young, to the very old, to people of various physical abilities. Some people are limited or handicapped, people of different intellectual aptitude, even in the distribution of wealth. The Catechism speaks, and this is an important thing, it's false to say that we can just simply order everyone to have the same amount of money or something like that. There are always going to be differences. So it's not like you can force and impose exact equality on everyone. When you try to do that, usually that doesn't work out. But if you have a situation, or if a culture or a society or a government is ordered toward the hoarding of materials in the hands of only a few, such that there is not concern for those that really go without. If you have a large number of people who are deprived of the opportunity to meet their needs because of an institutional hoarding of the resources in the hands only of a few, that becomes immoral. That can become immoral. Now, one of the things I think is a great remedy for that is when you see great charity. Charity is a great remedy for the hoarding is always selfish, and so rather than selfishness becomes charity. And so one of the things that I think is very admirable is when you see people who have been blessed, who do have a surplus, and when you see that they practice great charity, that is, I think, goes a very long way to repairing what would be otherwise something that could be very, very harmful. So the Catechism is kind of very careful, I think, in addressing this, but that if the distribution of wealth is somehow, if there's excessive disparity that brings about harm to the lower members of a society, that becomes immoral. That becomes a violation of the goal of social justice. Part of the problem is then, well, how do you repair that? And so this is where that question becomes political. And that's so what is the right quote unquote policy to somehow fix that? And then that gets very messy, because that becomes conservative ideas, liberal ideas, and then everyone fights with each other. But just the notion that, in fact, there should be the equitable distribution in the sense that people have the opportunity to meet the needs that they have within a society, and they have the opportunities to develop and to grow as a person. That is important, that everyone have reasonable access to that. So anyway, that's a topic that's kind of like touching the third rail a little bit. So I know if you're kind of starting to go, like you want to shoot your hand up and then ask about it. And then if we start taking questions now, then we're going to turn into The View. We're not going to do that. So we'll do. But anyway, it gets to be a very difficult thing. Another, beyond the respect for the human person, that's social justice. Beyond promoting an authentic sense of equality, the equality of respect for persons, which is another part of social justice. Then finally, a third part, human solidarity. The idea of friendship or charity, recognizing in solidarity that we have more that unites us than that divides us, and that we see ourselves more in connection with one another, that we are there to support and to help one another. Rather than dividing lines and seeing people as enemies acting against one another, we're actually trying to work together in a supportive way. So whether it's, for example, the rich and the poor, so they can support one another with a sense of mutual respect, especially when they act with great charity toward one another. The idea of those who are workers and those who are bosses or employers, they do not have to be enemies toward one another, but when they work toward with common purpose and with respect for one another, that is solidarity. That is, in fact, to be promoted as part of social justice. So that people, when they do labor or work, that they would receive a reasonable remuneration for their efforts. That's also part of social justice. And that's owed to them in the sense that part of our solidarity that we're bound to one another is that we want to make sure that people are able to provide for themselves. If a person is being woefully underpaid such that they're really being kept in disparate poverty, that becomes immoral. So it doesn't mean everyone needs to be paid equally, but just the idea that remuneration would be reasonable and respectful toward the human person. So toward that reasonable and equitable distribution of goods. This can help reduce social tensions, which is an important fruit that comes from solidarity. And this is not just it's a mistake to think of this only in terms of economics. Like this is just an economic factor. Like if it's just dispersed the right way, it's fine. It's a moral issue. It's more than just who gets the money and where does this go. It's more of the moral issue of how we respect one another, and that really is more at the heart. It's more important that there actually be that moral, the practice of the moral law and the respect for the other person, rather than the bank accounts be equalized or something like that, if that sort of helps out. But those would be some of the aspects of social justice: respect for the person, respect for equality, and promotion of human solidarity. Then after that, the Catechism kind of changes gears a little bit and speaks about the idea of law and grace. And law is an interesting factor when we think about, some of you may, if you've done any study of law, or I know at different times, sometimes you might have heard about different philosophical approaches to law. And so sometimes if a person's into making distinctions, they might divide different parts of the law. So we have the eternal law. The eternal law is in the mind of God. So it's the law as God himself envisions it. And so it's the perfection of God's law within the mind of God. And sometimes we can't know all the aspects of the eternal law because that's in the mind of God. But then we speak also about the eternal law as it's been implanted into our hearts and written into our human nature. And when we talk about nature, that's where we're talking about natural law. So natural law would be the part of the law that is made according to the way that God made us. And so it's a law that corresponds to our human nature. It has to do with the fact that we've been given by God's grace the capacity of recognizing that which is good and evil, and there's something intrinsic to our own human nature that we can recognize some of these things. It is a part of the divine law, and so it's something that philosophically we can come to reason toward. So there are things that are moral that we should do, and oftentimes it can be instinctive. It can be something that's an instinct that we recognize within ourselves. And yet at times, we don't always judge rightly the good and the bad. So sometimes, and this is part of our human nature, is that sometimes we don't always perceive things clearly. So we can sometimes go astray. So it's not as just we canonize whatever we think of as, well, I think that's good, so therefore that's natural law for me. No, the natural law itself is an objective and immutable and eternal truth. It's actually created not by us, it's created by God. It's God's law with respect to us, with respect to our human nature. And so sometimes we need some guidance with that. And so when we need some help to discover the natural law, this is where divine positive law comes in. So divine law is God's law. God says that. And when they say positive law, it doesn't mean positive as opposed to negative. To posit something means to, like, I'm going to posit an argument. I'm going to state something. So divine positive law would be the laws that God has posited or revealed or announced. That's what they mean by positive. So it would be the law that God himself has announced. So when we look at the scriptures, we can see times at which God has revealed his law and he's clarified. Okay, especially because sometimes we have a tendency to kind of want to do things our way and make excuses for what we think is right or what we might prefer to do. And then God comes back and he says, no, this is thou shalt not commit adultery, or thou shalt not, or thou shalt honor your father and mother. And so every time that there's a law that comes from God, where God intervenes and gives a specific direction, this helps to guide and to shape our conscience, and it also helps to guide and articulate and shape our understanding of the natural law. So these are all things that are written into the natural law for us, but God's positive law, God's divine positive law can help us they can be the guideposts that help us to recognize that more truly. That natural law, because it's immutable, it's true, and its origin is in God, it's an indispensable basis for our right action. So it's important for us always to observe the natural law. When it comes to divine law, that divine law was articulated in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, and so we can look at different passages in the Old Testament. And St. Paul refers to that in the letter to the Romans as a tutor. He says the old law was given to us as a guide. It's a tutor to monitor us. It's to point us in the right direction and get us ready to dispose us for the new law that was going to come in the Gospels. So the Gospels is not a different law. It is a new law, but it is a fulfillment of the old law. Remember, Jesus also said in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, no law shall pass away and until it has been fulfilled. And so we talk about the fulfillment of the old law. So sometimes there are laws that may have passed away in some sense, like you'd say you're allowed to eat, you can eat certain meat, but not the meat of unclean animals. Okay, well then, and obviously that law has changed. But what that law communicates on a deeper level is the idea of the importance of making sure that we avoid those things that would be sources of impurity or that would contaminate us. And in a larger moral sense, that law is as true today as it would have been in Old Testament times. So it's interesting how the Old Testament law, none of those laws were unimportant. Some of those laws may have been superseded by other laws, but they were all to prepare us for the invitation to come to know Jesus Christ. And if you say, oh, the old law, oh, thank God that's been done away with, not so fast. Because remember, the old law was easy. Thou shalt not do that, thou shalt not do that, thou shalt not do that. That's easy. The new law is hard. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Take up your cross. The new law actually is a lot harder. And the new law, in some senses, actually requires a lot more of us. Because it doesn't just say, here's the minimum you have to do. It's really calling us then to do the maximum, to do as much as possible, to follow our Lord Jesus. So don't think we got off easy because we were born under the dispensation of the new law of the gospel and not the old law from Moses or the Old Testament. But the old and new law fit together as part of the expression of divine law. And this new law of the gospel is the perfection then on earth of the divine law as announced by God. It is a grace. The law is a grace. It's a grace of the Holy Spirit, and it's given to us in love, and it teaches us how to love, and especially how to live a life of greater perfection, especially in the evangelical counsels, in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitudes. There's so many wonderful ways in which that law gives us so much guidance and enriches us to really know the Lord and how it is that we should act. So those are some things about law. And then beyond that come human laws. We have lots. So if I wanted to kind of complete the analysis of all different types of law, so then you have human laws that might be announced by governments. So you have civil law. We also have human laws that are given to us by church authorities. So those are ecclesiastical laws. So we have ecclesiastical law, civil laws, so divine law, natural law. So there are all these different laws, but there is a sense of hierarchy and order within those laws. Some laws may not always be just, so certain civil laws, okay, well, maybe they're not always that just. But divine law and natural law is always ordered toward our good, and it has its origin in God. The Catechism goes on with a section on grace and justification, and this is, with the time that's remaining, I'm not going to go too much into this, but this gets into an important thing about how we've just been spending all this time not just talking about societally how we should behave, but even if we go back even to the section before that on individually how we should behave. Individually, we want to follow our conscience, excuse me, and cultivate virtue and avoid vice and avoid sin, and use our free will to the best of our ability with our intellect, our passions, our free will, our reason. And so those are good things. And then in the society, we want to use the same powers and faculties that we have to order our society toward the common good. And so we talk now about all of these efforts that we have to do good. And so what happens if we do that which is good? We grow in holiness, and this is where we get to justification. And the reason why the reason why I'm kind of saying this way is because this is one of those issues that became a major debate in the Protestant Reformation about who justifies. And one of the dangers about everything that we've said up to this point, in this whole section on the third part of the Catechism on the moral life, everything up to this point, is we might be tempted, if we just stopped, if we didn't go into this next part, we might be tempted to just say, if I do the right thing, I will be holy, I will justify myself, I will earn my salvation. And whoops, that's the problem. Okay, as soon as we start to take that step, so it's really important that there be this section at the end of this part of the Catechism that really says, remember that all of this is a grace. And to be justified, which is another way of saying to be made righteous, that is only done by God. Only God can make us righteous. Every grace that we are given is a grace given to us by God, and grace, by definition, is undeserved. So it's really interesting that at the end of all of this, in which we talk about how we should take responsibility for our actions and make sure we're doing the right thing, we come back around with grace and justification to remind us that all of it has its root in God. And when we talk about merit, we do not merit anything from God. We don't deserve, that's another way of saying we don't deserve anything from God. We don't earn our salvation. What we receive, we receive through the merits of the passion of Jesus Christ. He is the one who merits this grace, which is given freely to us, by which we are saved. We participate in this work of being justified, of coming to righteousness. We participate that through our human freedom in cooperation with God's grace. And if it wasn't for God's grace, our human freedom on its own would not be able to accomplish any of these things. I think sometimes if you try to overcome a bad habit, or if you think about something that's like a real challenging thing to do, we can all probably reflect on how hard it is sometimes for us to do certain things. So certain fundamental changes that we might want to make are really hard. And it's just a reminder that, boy, if it wasn't for God's grace, we'd be in a lot of trouble. And so so at the risk of, there's a lot of detailed arguments that are made kind of briefly in this part of the Catechism, but we talk about being made righteous. It means that we have to grow in conversion, we have to be detached from sin, we have to accept God's righteousness. We have to cooperate with God's grace. We have to act with our human freedom. And every one of these things happens in union with God's help. God's grace leads us along this entire path. And while we can refuse to cooperate with God's grace, we can't do it alone. And so we depend on God's grace. So we talked about sanctifying grace, which is a habitual, stable disposition on our part to always respond with God and to live with God. And we benefit from the actual graces God gives us to help us at specific moments in our lives. And we receive sacramental graces, that in the sacraments that we participate in, we receive real grace, real help from God. All of this then helps us to grow in holiness. Holiness is progressing to a more intimate union with Christ, which is all of our goals. So in our actions, but also in our mind, in coming closer to the mind of Christ, adapting our mind to the mind of Christ, training our dispositions to be more aligned with God's ways, with God's dispositions. This is a critical requirement for us in the moral life. So it's an important part of the catechism. It's kind of like a little shift that kind of comes at the end. But boy, what an important one. And one that was that conflict between Martin Luther and the Catholic Church. And although Martin Luther made more of the conflict than I think was really there, because the Church has always held on to this important teaching of grace and salvation. But what an important thing to say. So then at the end of this section, before we get to the Ten Commandments, the Catechism talks about the Church as a mother and a teacher. So the Church with the magisterium, we talked about the magisterium way back at the beginning of the class. And so the Church teaches us how to live the moral life. And the Church has a responsibility to do this as a loving mother, to teach the truth, to teach about faith and morals. Here's what is right and what is wrong. Here's how we should live. And the Church has the authority to do that and can teach those things, especially infallibly. How important it is to be responsive to God and to the guidance we receive from the magisterium of the Church to live a moral life, to receive those moral teachings, and then to respond to them with that childlike trust, to do what the Church challenges us to do. And at the end of this section, the Catechism reminds us of some of the precepts of the Church. So not just simply like the Ten Commandments, which continue to be valuable markers for us, but in particular, some of the things the Church expressly asks us to do. This is ecclesiastical law, but in conformity with divine law. The precepts of the Church: we should attend Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. We are asked to confess our sins once a year. The recommendation would be to do that during Lent. We are encouraged to receive Holy Communion at least once a year. Now remember that this was originally written at a time when people didn't receive communion frequently. They would go to confession and then ask for the permission to receive communion. So you might receive communion this would be before Pius X, when people might receive, very rarely, communion. They go to Mass, but they might not receive communion all the time. And so the Church said you have to receive communion at least annually, preferably during the Easter season, to keep the laws of the Church on fast and abstinence, to support the Church, provide for the needs of the Church, and also to respect the laws of the Church governing marriage. So those are, just at the end, those are the precepts of the Church, and that's kind of where the Catechism finishes this section right before starting commandment number 1. And that's where we're going to pick up as we talk about the commandment to love God and neighbor, and we'll apply them in the 10 Commandments. And that's when it all gets juicy. So now we'll talk, then we'll get to like specifically, so what do these commandments tell us? And so what sins should we be mindful of that would be violations of the 10 Commandments? So kind of the next 3 sessions will kind of go through a kind of an examination of conscience by looking at the different sins that would violate each of the 10 Commandments. So glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.